U.S. President Joe Biden has warned against isolationism in his final address to the United Nations General Assembly on Tuesday, declaring, "We are stronger than we think when the world acts together." President Joe Biden underscored the importance of alliances and U.S. support for Ukraine in its war with Russia in his final address to the United Nations General Assembly. His appearance before the international body offers Biden one of his last high-profile opportunities as president to make the case to keep up robust support for Ukraine, which could be in doubt if former President Donald Trump, who has scoffed at the cost of the war, defeats Vice President Kamala Harris in November.
My fellow leaders, today is the fourth time I've had the great honor of speaking to this assembly as President of the United States. It'll be my last. I've seen a remarkable sweep of history. I know many look at the world today and see difficulties and react with despair, but I do not. I won't. As leaders, we don't have the luxury. I recognize the challenges from Ukraine to Gaza to Sudan and beyond. War, hunger, terrorism, brutality, record displacement of people, a climate crisis, democracy at risk, strains within our societies, the promise of artificial intelligence and its significant risk. The list goes on. But maybe because all I've seen and all we have done together over the decades, I have hope. I know there is a way forward. There will always be forces that pull our countries apart and the world apart. Aggression, extremism, chaos, and cynicism. A desire to retreat from the world and go it alone. Our test is to make sure that the forces holding us together are stronger than those who are pulling us apart. That the principles of partnership that we came here each year to uphold can withstand the challenges. That the center holds once again. Each of us in this body has made a commitment to the principles of the UN Charter to stand up against aggression. When Russia invaded Ukraine, we could have stood by and merely protested. But Vice President Harris and I understood that that was an assault on everything this institution was supposed to stand for. And so, in my direction, America stepped into the breach, providing massive security and economic and humanitarian assistance. Our NATO allies and partners in 50-plus nations stood up as well. But most importantly, the Ukrainian people stood up. I asked the people of this chamber to stand up for them. The good news is Putin's war has failed and at his core aim. He set out to destroy Ukraine, but Ukraine is still free. He set out to weaken NATO, but NATO is bigger, stronger, and more united than ever before, with 2 new members, Finland and Sweden. But we cannot let up. The world now has another choice to make. Will we sustain our support to help Ukraine win this war and preserve its freedom, or walk away and let aggression be renewed and a nation be destroyed? I know my answer. We cannot grow weary. We cannot look away. And we will not let up on our support for Ukraine, not until Ukraine wins a just and durable peace in the UN Charter.
And for more on this, let's cross live to New York and speak with Arise international correspondent Adefemi Akinsanya. Hello, Adefemi, great to see you. What do you make of President Joe Biden's final address to the United Nations General Assembly, especially his call for support for Ukraine in its war with Russia?
Thank you, Georgina. Always great to hear from you. Yes, definitely. Listening to Joe Biden's speech, it was quite interesting, but also very expected. As you've said, this is going to be his last time as president of the free world, as the US president, taking to the stage at the general debate. So there was a lot of anticipation as to what he was going to say. And perhaps there are no prizes for guessing that he talked a lot about foreign policy. He talked a lot about what's happening, the ongoing crisis in the Middle East, and his rhetoric did change a little bit. While the United States continues to look at Israel as an ally, continues to say that Israel has the right to defend itself, what we are also seeing, not only from Joe Biden, but indeed Kamala Harris herself, is a softening when it comes to the humanitarian crisis happening in Palestine, happening most especially in Gaza. So when he took to the stage, President Biden, he did talk about how the humanitarian crisis taking place in Gaza is what he describes as hell. He said the people are going through hell there. And then that echoes what we heard Kamala Harris talk about during the DNC, where she says while Israel does have the right to defend itself, how it does so matters. And it does seem that that is the same rhetoric being shared by Joe Biden as he took to the stage at the general debate. Staying with the theme of international news, he also talked about what we're seeing in Russia and Ukraine. He said that Vladimir Putin had failed in his attempt to destroy Ukraine and destroy NATO. We do know, of course, that Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues to be the case to this day. But very strong words from the US president there, saying that essentially Vladimir Putin has failed in his attempts to obliterate and destroy Ukraine and NATO, both of them, the country and the organization, still moving strong, according to the president. And then too, moving on from the Middle East and then talking about what we're seeing in Russia, he then moved on to talk about the presidency, about the US election taking place on the 5th of November, and talked about again how imperative it is for the world to keep their eyes on what's happening in the United States, making sure that his successor will be Kamala Harris, of course his pick, making sure that she and the Democrats do stay in the White House come November. So all in all, quite an expected speech in terms of the topics that he hit, but still an emotional one nevertheless. He did speak clearly and coherently, and it will be very interesting to see who replaces him come this time next year, when it's time next year for the next US president, whether or not that be Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, to take the stage at the UN General Assembly, especially during the great debate.
Very strong words during his final address there. But well, make us understand the priorities for this year's session, the global priorities at this time. What are they focusing on? What are the leaders saying?
As it stands now, there's a huge focus on intention when it comes to trying their hardest to keep these sides in the Middle East away from the brink of war. With every day that passes, it does seem as though more and more reports of escalating tensions, of airstrikes, of rockets, of death tolls continues to be the case. Overnight, we do know that Israel did send strikes into Lebanon, which killed nearly 500 people. That is the single most deadliest attack on Hezbollah targets on Lebanon by Israel in history as it pertains to this current crisis, this current conflict. So it is quite expected that when we're looking at international order and all of these high-level meetings taking place, the heads of state all gathered here in New York, the primary focus is trying to stave away from war and focus on peace. But it's becoming very, very difficult because, as we've said, the Middle East is on the brink of war between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, also too Israel and Hamas, and then the humanitarian crisis therein with people being obliterated. Essentially, the bombardment of humanitarian targets in Gaza continues to be the case. So there is a lot of issues going on around the world, but these bigger conflicts, what we're seeing in the Middle East and definitely Russia's invasion of Ukraine, continue to dominate the world order. And I do imagine that as we continue across more and more countries, more and more heads of states taking to the stage, it will be talking about initially their own countries and how their countries fit into the state of the world as it stands now, but also understanding in what ways they can contribute to a cooling of tensions, in what ways can political allies talk to whichever side they are closest to and try and bring them to some form of a truce, some form of a ceasefire. Especially when we're looking at the Middle East, we go back and forth, it seems, every other week about there being talks about a US brokered ceasefire that won't be signed at the last minute. What we're seeing with Qatar and other Arab entities trying again to bring Hamas to the negotiation table. So that's definitely dominating discourse now. There's no way to really get away from it. But in addition to conflict and moving away from conflict, there's also a huge focus on the climate. This is, of course, Climate Change Week here in New York, so there's a lot of focus on different issues. Just Yesterday evening, it was the Goalkeepers event hosted by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and a huge portion of the Goalkeepers theme was looking at nutrition in a sustainable world, a world that is focused a lot more on environmental cleanliness, environmental access, especially as it pertains to food security. So that's also something that's dominating discourse at the United Nations here, Georgina.
In all these issues, how is Africa's role being emphasized in the different discussions taking place at the sessions?
Georgina, tell me again. I only caught the very long, the tail end of what you just said. Please ask me again.
I'm talking about the role of Africa in, how is the role of Africa being emphasized in all of the discussions taking place at the session?
Thank you. Looking at the role of Africa, it is obviously going to be something that you can't deny Africa's presence when it comes to the United Nations. And there is definitely a whole host of conversations being had under the theme and the umbrella of the climate, for example. There's definitely going to be conversations about what type of negotiations and security can be extended to countries that are on the African continent and struggling with different types of climate-focused crises. For example, the flooding that we're seeing in Maiduguri across Borno State is, of course, a disaster because of the overflowing of a dam, but it has triggered what is already existing climate-focused crises in the country. So that's also something that African leaders are looking at. In addition to that, there's also the focus of what we're seeing in terms of conflict. Africa too isn't shielded from conflict. We can see what's happening in the Sahel region. We see the likes of Niger and Mali being able to stay away from ECOWAS, for example, and ECOWAS and other countries who are represented here at the United Nations obviously trying to get those countries to move away from their desire to stay away from them and bring together some form of a lasting type of peace. Looking at Nigeria specifically, we do have quite a strong presence here, not only in terms of private sectors. We do know that we have the likes of Aliko Dangote also on ground. He has been appearing at a few different events today and yesterday. Of course, Afreximbank to Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala is also here. But then let us not forget that Nigeria is aptly represented by the federal government as well as state governments too. Actually, just yesterday on Monday, we were at a ministerial briefing, or at least on the sidelines of a ministerial briefing, and got to speak to different ministers about what ideas they have, what it is that there are their specific goals as it pertains to their own ministries as they are here at UNGA. And primarily, the general consensus is firstly a focus on the Vice President. He will be taken to the stage on Wednesday evening. There is some reports that his slot may change, but as it stands now, he will be taken to the stage on Wednesday evening, which will be very early in the morning in Nigeria, around 2 a.m., unless anything changes. He will be delivering the speech that President Bola Ahmed Tinubu was supposed to deliver. So there was some confusion about whether or not his remarks would be his own or whether or not they would be the president's. We do have clarity now that he will be delivering the speech that President Tinubu would be delivering. But again, in addition to his presence here, there's also a lot of sideline conversations with different ministries, especially this evening. We are expected to be attending, or at least being able to understand what is happening with the country's Ministry of Arts and Innovative Culture. Minister Hannatu Musawa is also on ground. We spoke to her yesterday and we're expecting to see her this evening at Destination 2030, which is an event that seems to focus on the prospect of harnessing Nigeria's creative and digital talent. So there's a lot happening as it pertains to the African continent, but most especially our very own Nigeria.
Before I let you go, what has been the response to Nigeria's request to have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council? I know we made that request. I don't know if there's any update regarding that.
There isn't as it stands now. It will be interesting whether or not the Vice President will mention that in his remarks, because Nigeria, along with African countries, have made it quite clear. It's something I discussed this morning during the Global Brief about how there is a desire, a push for African countries to be included in this US Security Council, especially when African countries, African nations and African diaspora communities are going to be involved in decisions made by the Security Council. So for example, we do have the likes of Kenya deploying 600 more police officers to Haiti to help fight the insecurity and the gang-based violence in the island nation, and that would take the number of Kenyan police officers well above 1,000. And what we are seeing, according to what we've been hearing from President of Kenya, William Ruto, is that it is his desire to establish a fully fledged UN peacemaking mission off the back of the Kenyan presence there. So if we are seeing that there are African countries that are committed to humanitarian efforts, that do want to continue and create what we're seeing in terms of United Nations peacekeeping efforts, then surely they do deserve a seat at the table when it comes to the Security Council. I say that because in order for Kenya and Haiti and those police officers to be able to secure more funding and actually become a UN fully fledged peacekeeping mission, the UN Security Council has to vote on that, has to meet on that, and they will be doing so towards the end of this month. But it will be very interesting to see before then whether or not there will be an establishment of more African presence within these security councils, because it doesn't make sense that African problems will be discussed without the presence of African countries.
Thank you so much, Adefemi. Thank you. Really appreciate you speaking with Rise International correspondent Adefemi Akinsanya at UNGA in New York. And Rise News most definitely will be on hand to broadcast live the Vice President's speech when he delivers it on Wednesday.